The full scripture is chapter 6 of John 1 through 15. And just this morning I decided I'm really only referring to basically 3 sentences. And so I thought, well, I'll read the section that contains those 3 sentences. Y'all have heard the story of the feeding of 5,000, right? All right, so you know where to look for it. If you wanted to check up on the story and read that whole section, it's available. But I decided just for time and maybe y'all can get some vitamin D if you go from here today and you can soak up some sun. Okay, it may be a little cold for that kind of soaking. But so we're going to read from John 6, starting at verse 5, and go to 9. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" And he asked this only to test him, for he already had a mind of what he was going to do. And Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" So we're sort of still hop, skipping, and jumping a little bit through John and about Jesus' early ministry. And this occurs, well, people are treating him like, I guess, a really famous person or a rock star. All of a sudden they want to be wherever he is. And if you're reading where we started, it's because these people have been witnessing the healings that Jesus has been doing. And then, well, I guess he's got healing groupies or miracle groupies that are going from place to place. And Jesus and his disciples, if you were reading the previous chapter, sort of disappeared and got away. And what they did is they crossed the lake to go and, I guess, get away far enough to have a little rest, because they've been doing this people out on the hillside preaching and healing for a few days here. And so now they've just sort of headed across, and all these people suddenly come around the end of the lake walking. So they're going several miles out of their way. I didn't even measure a distance. But so here all these people are approaching Jesus because they're catching up. They could almost see across the lake where they are, so they didn't have to go very far, really, being that in that day they talked. And they talk about it also, they call it the Sea of Tiberias, which is a little bit more modern name, or maybe it's just where you're from, but we typically find in Scripture it says the Sea of Galilee. So it's the same lake, it's the same body of water. And here we have these people are coming, and Jesus, I'm sure he takes a little compassion. He's looking down. It says he walked up the mountain, and maybe it's just a really steep hill. I'm not sure. There's places people go to visit when they go to Israel that they say this is the place. And so they say you can find it. And he and his disciples go and sit, and they're just seeing this mass of people coming toward them. And so Jesus suddenly puts Philip on the spot. He turns to him and says, "Where are we going to go buy some bread for all these people?" I could almost imagine that Philip's color started draining out of his face, because this is sort of a pop quiz. I don't know about y'all, but I was never real keen on tests. I got a little nervous. I never figured out how to study properly for a blood test. And my scores, they keep telling me, are getting worse and worse, so I know I'm not studying right. And then in school, you're always worried about, chalkboard was my day. Later on, it has become dry erase markers, I guess. But in my day, it was the chalkboard, especially in elementary school, that you went up and you would do a problem on the board. And there was always the chance that you wouldn't get it right, or you didn't know the answer, or maybe you hadn't studied enough to be ready for it. But when they call you to the board, it's a pop quiz for one person, because everybody else is going to watch while they work the problem. And that's sort of what's happened to Philip. It's so easy, especially with kids, to get branded a little bit. People make fun of you if you mess up, and so same thing happens with adults. If you're ever on a trivia team and you make a little mistake and you miss one question, it might be that you hear it come back over and over, and every opportunity to retell the story, and other people can laugh about it or be disappointed that you didn't know the answer. I mean, that kind of thing happens to you. You can be branded as someone that doesn't test well. Well, Philip doesn't sound like he doesn't test well, but it's like he does a math equation really quick in his head, and he's thinking it over, and says, okay, we're going to go buy bread. He doesn't even worry about where to buy bread. They're in sort of a in-between villages. There's nothing supposedly right around where they are, and so he didn't really answer the where question. He starts answering the calculating up. Okay, if I'm going to go buy appetizer breadsticks for this many people, man, that's a lot. The word probably goes something like this. Okay, 5,000 men plus women and children are walking at 3.17 miles an hour, approaching the where Jesus is, and where are you going to buy bread? Okay, I know it doesn't. It's not really. It's like a trick question. But he's calculating what he can see, a mass of people walking toward them. He can only guess how many people there are. And so his answer to Jesus is, I don't know how we do it. It's 200 denarii, depending on the translation you read. Or it's 6 months' salary, or depending on how you want to interpret it, it's 8 months' salary. We just can't do that. Maybe you looked over at the money purse. It didn't look like it was filled with 200 denarii coins, so they didn't even have the cash to do it. So he has these doubts. He immediately throws out that he just doesn't know how they would do it, and that's where it sort of stays. And then the next person that speaks up is Simon Peter's brother. It seems that they both have this tendency to speak out. Peter, we hear about it more often than Andrew. But Andrew speaks out. He says, hey, there's this boy over here. He's got a lunch. It's got 3 barley loaves and a couple of dried fish. And hey, I don't know what good that'll do you, but that's what we got. So neither one of them dealt with the real problem. Now, we had a little insight in there that Jesus knew what he was going to do. That this test wasn't exactly a test to get a real answer from him. Either one of them. One volunteered, the other one did his own. But the test was not a calculation for math or complex issues. It was asking them to, how are you going to deal with this? How are we going to satisfy a hunger for this many people? These people have been already on the other side of the lake for some part of the day, and now they've walked around. They're further from their villages than they were. It's a lot of people gathered up. So, the two statements that caught my attention that I focused on for today are the two, we know it's a test, the question from Jesus, and then the two answers. You have Philip, and he doesn't go to what appears to us, maybe it's because of our history of studying this, even in children's Sunday school, where you would read about this boy who came forward and gave his lunch. We don't hear in this statement, in this description, in this scripture, all the details. This is the only, one of 10 events that in this Jesus' life that appear in all four Gospels. So it's pretty unusual. It's pretty unusual because this is 1 and 9 are left. So that there are little differences that you will hear. When I say differences, there'll be a few details here and there. But here we have these two men and how they're answering Jesus. And Philip's answer is basically, Lord, it's impossible. We don't have the money. We don't have, if he'd gone further, he might have looked around and said, I don't know where's the mall? I don't see a mall anywhere close. I don't see a bread store. It's not even a discount bread store in sight, so we'd have to go around and look for a place. He may be full of reasons why they ought to probably send these people away. In other tellings, other Gospels, they actually encourage Jesus to let them handle their own meal problem. I don't know. Trying not to use the word test too much, because I know some people might be like me and they don't exactly like tests. And I know there's some. I've known a few that just love tests. They wanted to test on everything. They would get the teacher to give them extra tests. Okay, they were weird. I don't know where they are. They're probably really rich or something by now. But because they seem to thrive in that environment. I'm not sure Philip did, especially in the environment he was trying to be in. See, our reaction to that kind of question from Jesus, we might do what Philip and really also what Andrew did, and that is to look at what resources were immediately available. Decision very quickly about whatever we feel like we're being asked. Sometimes we get these random ideas in our head about, well, maybe our church ought to do this, or maybe I ought to do that. Sometimes we resist those I maybe ought to a lot, but at church, sometimes it's like, we'll say, the church ought to be doing something about these people I saw in the paper or on the news. Sometimes those kind of things pop in our mind, and we don't always give credit to anything beyond ourselves. That maybe it was God putting that in your head, that there was this choice that he was trying to ask you to consider. And so we can easily dismiss it when we say, well, I don't have enough money to solve all those transportation problems or language problems or food problems. Because, we never really have enough. I guess even lottery winners end up spending most or all their money. It seems like they ought to have enough, but that's not really what we're on this morning. This random thought, though, is sort of a test from God for how will you respond, and what do you look at first? And if the first thing you look at is your resources, your time, your grace, your love, maybe your skills, maybe it's even the skill level of other people in our church. Maybe you look and say, well, we just can't do it. We don't have what's needed to do those things and to get people's attention. We don't have the manpower to accomplish whatever this task was that might have appeared in your mind. Maybe you dreamed about it. Maybe it was just something that came up. In a way, I think that's like Philip had a question of, he wasn't thinking about where to buy bread when Jesus turned to him and said, how are we going to feed these people? It's a pretty big ask. We don't know why Philip was lucky enough to be the one on the spot, but he was. But his answer was, we don't have enough to make it happen. In this case, it was money. I don't know. Christians, I do believe, are tested by the Lord. Now, we're not being tested to embarrass us. Sometimes it's maybe to correct us. I believe that we're tested in a lot of different ways. And sometimes it's those things that pop in your head, or choices we make, or deciding, I'm going to go to the Bible study. It might be your first time. And, something that just sort of sparks you to make a response. And the test is, what are you going to do about this idea that you had? Are you going to act on it? Or are you going to say, I don't have the time. I'm not interested in that. Or some other response. You see, it's not just a test about buying bread. I don't know, these occasional tests that come to us, what I think they measure is our heart and faith and even love of God sometimes. It's about, how will we respond? Depends on who asks. Somebody, Peter mentioned mama, and I said, when mama asks for something, you try to do it. Otherwise, another mama will give you a whipping. I sort of said it that way. There's certain people that you really don't want to say no to, or you try not to, and depending on what it is, sometimes you have to. But the choices are: do you make a respectful no, or do you act on it and do the best you can? When we are tested by God, it's, do you trust God? Do you believe in God's power? Do you have expectations that the promises of God, for not just you, but for everybody, are true? God puts these opportunities into our hearts and minds sometimes. And the things that they're not testing, first is that it's not testing, I have this idea that the preacher ought to do, or Branson ought to do, or Barbara ought to do, or insert anybody but your name in that spot ought to do. That's not what God's test is intended for, because it's really a personal test. Something that comes to you. And the second thing it's not an examinations. It's not a time to examine your resources and strengths and weaknesses and using those reasons, those excuses to give you a reason not to respond to something that you feel like you might have been asked to consider. How would you deal with that problem? I think most of the time it's not as generic as people think it might be. And sometimes it's a very specific, small, focused, maybe even a one-person opportunity for ministry that comes into your mind. Doesn't mean you're going down and canvassing downtown on Broad Street. Maybe God would ask you to do that, but more likely, God is asking you for something very specific, not 5,000 people to come to your house for lunch. That's a very rare request that Jesus took care of himself. So Philip wasn't alone I guess, the faith problem of looking at what they had available as a group and as an individual. I doubt he even had a wallet to have money in it. We have Simon Peter's brother Philip, or Andrew. And he has his own response. It was, well, here's this boy with 5 fish. And you know what? If he had stopped right there and said, what can we do with that, Jesus? He would have been right on track. Because that's really what our message is that we say, well, this is what I've got. How can you use it, Jesus? But he continued. He says, but how could this little meal do any good at all? I guess you could have fed it to Jesus, say, Jesus, eat this, you'll have a little energy because these people are going to want healing. You could have used it in a very targeted, specific thing. I don't know, Andrew seems to have brought this boy forward just because maybe he was just convenient. Maybe he could see he was holding his lunch there. I don't know how and why. He seems to be a boy who is okay. Maybe he even offered. Maybe he wanted the opportunity to meet Jesus, said, hey, he can have my lunch. He wasn't necessarily buying his way in. We don't know anything about the boy except he happened to have 3 barley loaves and 2 fish. Not much. A kid's happy meal. Well, not even that good. A snack. Depending on how big the boy was, I guess. The idea is that we know a couple of things about the boy. He probably was willing to give the lunch. I don't think Andrew was going to take it away from him and give it to Jesus to do something with. I think he was freely offering it in some way. Or maybe he just observed and pointed the boy out. We're not exactly sure, but it sounds like he brought him over. And then the other thing we know is his lunch is not the lunch of a rich family. Okay, barley bread now is a prime thing. There's no cholesterol. There's B12 in it. When you eat barley bread, they say, I looked this up on the ads, okay? It says that it reduces the cholesterol in your bloodstream if you eat barley loaf. And so it's a heart-healthy food. And so I guess that's why it costs 3 times as much per slice as it costs for a really good name brand. Wheat bread. You got the big oat wheat bread about this big that big for the family, and then the barley loaf is a little bitty loaf. They didn't know anything about the health benefits of barley back then. Barley is what you fed your animals. It wasn't what you went by the bakery to buy. They probably baked some. It was probably baked at home. They ground up some of the wheat and some of the grain they got from the fields, and then they were making bread from it. And barley bread, especially in their day, would have been very coarse and tough. And, maybe it's sort of like a slice of pita, except supposedly tougher and more hard lumps. It was the meal of the poor, along with the 2 fish, probably 2 small dried fish, because they were the cheap staple that a poor family could get. So whoever this boy was, he was. Well, his mom had blessed him enough that he had a little piece of cloth wrapped up or a little bag that he had a lunch in, but he was not. Well, he was only being taken care of by his mom with the cheapest meal that they probably had a lot around whatever his house was. So we have Andrew saying, I got this boy with a kid's meal. What do we? And he goes on to say, but it's not enough. So Andrew's faith was also lacking, as in converting that to say, what about this Jesus? It's not really ours, but it looks like we could give it to you. Can you do something with that? Andrew, I don't know. He really doesn't do much math. He just sort of knows that one kid's meal does not feed even a few adult people. So his math didn't have to be trying to calculate how many people were out there and how many breadsticks you'd have to get to everybody to get a bite. His was, there's just nothing here. Not enough to make a difference even in a grown man's appetite. The problem that goes with doing calculations about what's available and what you have. It only considers, when we do that, it only considers what we as individuals or as a group could do can't do. It doesn't take into account what Jesus is capable of doing in this test that was presented to Philip. He asked Philip first. Andrew joined in the conversation, so he participates. At least he's thinking it through. I don't know, do you know what this kind of thinking does in our lives? When we look at our limitations as the baseline of what we can and won't do, what happens is we never get to the point where we can experience and understand what the Lord's purpose and power are for your life. It's about your life. It's about what does God want you to do? Most of us have enough faith to say, I'm saved. I've made a decision for Christ. That is the first step of the Christian life, of a spiritual life, is to say, I'm saved. I'm a member of the kingdom of God. Jesus is my brother. Those are all things that are the first step. From then on, these little tests come up, and we start having to make choices about how we are going to participate in this family. How are we going to reach out into the world like Jesus is asking them to consider this question? How are we going to feed these people? Not that they're going to get all their names, they're not going to put them on a mailing list. They were just going to feed them. And then from then it might go forward to seeing what else would come forward. Will there be people that need a healing and a blessing? It never gets that far, by the way. The people, Jesus reads their minds, I guess, or their intent, and realize that they're about to go off track for the plan that God has. I don't know, when we sit around always evaluating what we can do based on what our resources are, well, there's a good chance it's like we're living under a kind of religion that says, yeah, we agree God says He'll provide, and we believe that can happen, but we never really expect and trust God to do something because we know we can't do it. So we limit God. I don't know, most of the time, when we look at what we can afford and what we can't, we never step up to the opportunity to really see what God has planned for us. Sometimes the things we worry about are painful, and they're real, and they hurt. And so we feel like that we've not really been blessed, and we're afraid to trust God for certain things because we sort of put God in His own box of, well, He doesn't really always hear my prayers, and I'm worried about it. If we never really give what we do have to God, then there's a chance that we won't receive the healing and the blessing and the touch. And I say, I'm not talking about always physical healing. I'm talking about receiving the knowledge and the closeness of God that He does know who we are. So the healing of that relationship. You see, we have to somehow really come to believe that God is on the move. And we're along the way. And there are certain things that, well, He would like us to benefit people in certain ways. You see, there's no question that we have limits. Most of us can't work 24 hours a day. Maybe never did. Most of us don't have unlimited wealth. If you do, I don't know, and you don't need to tell me if you do. Maybe there are people in the world that do, but even they have things that hurt them, bother them. They have fears they have. So there are all kinds of situations where people, well, they're living through what is a hell on earth to them. It might be their health. It might be a family member's health. It might be loss. Those are real things in people's lives, and then they don't really have a way of healing from it. I think it's because they don't give anything directly to God. They say, oh, I trust God. God's taking care of me. But then on the inside, they may not feel it, and they don't really come to a point of recovering like might be possible if they were more integral in the discussion with Jesus and with God. So there are things that happen to us financially. Things, talents, skills, choices, all kinds of things that limit us, and they'll always be there. But if that is what controls and guides our life, then we will never really move to a point of finding improvement, changes, maybe confidence, maybe just a growing love of God. The test that we receive and trusting the Lord. It's how we react to opportunities. You see, Philip was a disciple. He was always going to be a disciple. Andrew was a disciple. It wasn't they weren't believers. They were coming to believe far more. In fact, I think when you have Jesus in your presence, you do want to be a groupie, a miracle groupie, a blessing groupie. It's something that you want. But when it came time for them to say, how will you deal with this opportunity, this test? How will you feed those people that are walking up here right now? They didn't turn to Jesus and said, I hadn't got a clue. What do you got, Jesus? What can you do? And the finding of the small meal, it's just like, well, this boy says we can have his meal. Is there something we can do with this? Because they've been watching Jesus heal people, change people's lives, and now when they are asked about how will you solve it, they didn't look to Jesus to find a way to deal with the opportunity of those people walking forward. To give them some comfort, to give them some energy, so when they headed home later, that they would feel a little better than if they were just trotting over there, because they weren't necessarily going to take care of themselves there. These ideas that pop into our mind that might be ministry opportunities, they are the things that God has gifted you for. Now, sometimes the word gifting can be interpreted to mean only good things. Experience in life is a gift, even if it's really hard and bad and painful experiences. Loss in your life means that you are somewhat of an expert on loss. And sometimes people around you have almost identical situations. You don't think you're equipped? If you've survived that, and if you still have your faith in God, are you not equipped with God's help to go and be a blessing to that person? Because just to stay there with your mouth shut and let them talk. That's a gift. So we have these two men who probably do what we do most of the time. Looked at what resources they had. What's in my pocket? What's in my bank account? What's in my time schedule? What's on my calendar? What is it that I know how to do that I can go and take care of? Andrew brought the only resource that he saw for feeding people. Maybe just good luck. Maybe it was what was intended by Jesus in the first place. No matter how bad we all are off, we always have the opportunity to offer the metaphorical ramen noodle pack and say, Lord, all I've got is this little bit of one meal to offer to you. Show me if there's something you can do with it, or something I can do with it. How do I deal with it? See, this isn't about saying you've got to have all your ducks in a row and you've got to have surplus to give to God. It's saying I'm giving myself and my choices to God. And then I'm going to watch, no matter how pointless my sack of barley bread is, no matter how pointless that is, if I'm offering it to Jesus, and He can bless it and distribute it, and we're going to see amazing things happen. I hope you've had some experiences like that come back to your mind. I've seen some really interesting things. I've seen all kinds of people blessed by things, not because I was doing them, but because I saw Christ doing them. The boy wasn't willing to give up his happy meal. Would have ever been anything more than a kid's meal? No. What if the disciples didn't take it and take his, hey, give this to Jesus if that's what happened? What if they just said, oh, no. Would they have held back the blessing that was offered through that meal when Jesus touched it, blessed it, and distributed it? I don't think it would have changed anything. It would have been the people went away hungry. They wouldn't have experienced this grand public miracle that we read about in Sunday school, especially as a child. Only one boy would have had satisfaction from a meal if it hadn't been offered to Jesus. even though it was pointless. It's just barley bread. It's just a couple of fish. Church, when we hang on to things, ideas that allow us to hinder how we're going to respond to Jesus' directions, if we hang on to things, reserving resources or abilities, I think it's really done out of fear. We don't know how long the month, what else is going to happen in the month? We don't know. So sometimes it's just simple fear, and those are real things. It is not that Jesus asks you to really give everything you have, except to say you're willing to give who you are and what you have to God, to Jesus. If that controls and dominates your life, then you're missing the blessing of seeing Jesus work around you, in you, and through you, because you are still waiting for your healing and your trust to grow. Because the real thing that's in this test, if it's a test of faith, every time you take that test, you may not pass correctly. But if you keep being tested, what actually happens is you start to grow in faith. Because once you start taking a little step here, move there, take a little action here, you start growing in that understanding that God's moving somewhere and is asking you to go. It's that you can take your experience and turn it into a place where you can help someone else find a healing touch from God. There are a lot of Christians who are not healed and trusting of God beyond their salvation. They have not progressed in the step and grown in their faith except to say what they initially learned and felt. It's a growing relationship. It's a staircase that we work our way up. I don't think Jesus really had directly, can't, want, and I don't think those were really in his vocabulary. He had that slight advantage of being God, and he could do anything. I know we have different times when we have manure piles in our life that we don't know what to do with. But when we give it to Christ, it can turn into the bed of flowers. It can turn into watching families fed. It can turn into all kinds of things, because that pile of seemingly unimportant stuff is actually something that changes us. A long time ago, I had an aunt. She died at 105 or something. She was really into flowers, and after she got her cataract surgery, she could see the Braves games she always listened to. Well, when James was very small, my dad called up and says, "We need to go out to Barry. I need to use your truck, and will you come and go with me?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, no problem." And so James gets in the truck with me, and we meet Dad out at Barry, and so we drive out to the cattle barns, and he goes into the office, comes out, and this guy comes out with a skid steer, one of those little shovel things, and they pick up a load of manure and dump it in the back of my truck. James asked me, "Don't we like Aunt Edith?" Because this was her Christmas present. Okay? But Aunt Edith was able to take that gift, and she really loved her flowers, and she used what other people were rejecting and turned it into beauty that she could see again when she came to that point. Folks, the reason we have our faith tested is not to embarrass us. It is a tool to help us to grow and love and trust God more and more. But it doesn't start unless you're willing to give what you have and who you are to God. And I mean, really make that choice. And that's how God grows us and matures us to be servants. The disciples it didn't say they really saw the miracle. They just knew Jesus kept handing them. If you read the whole scripture, he's passing out the bread, and then they come back and he passes out the fish. But what was happening is those disciples that might have had their doubts of how they were going to feed 5,000 plus people, they participated in the distribution of Jesus' gift of that meal. They became servants. They grew a little more in their understanding of Christ. Christ didn't just heal people that came on the beds. Christ solved a simple problem of hunger. Temporary hunger. Something they could deal with. Something they weren't going to die from. Our faith is only limited by us don't trusting our Lord with what we have. All glory be to God.